I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Barenbaum.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Hanukkah. And we certainly need light in a world of darkness at this point. And hopefully we're getting some light with the arrival of the COVID vaccine and all that implies. So I wish you all health and safety from California, which is virtually shut down completely. Let me tell you what we're going to do, and I have an unenviable assignment today. My assignment is to give you a basic introduction to the Holocaust in 45 minutes. In further sessions, we're going to have some of the most prominent Holocaust scholars in the world, literally the most prominent Holocaust scholars in the world, speak to you about the area of their expertise. Next month, we're going to have Peter Hayes, who has just written a marvelous book, which is the culmination of his teaching career at Northwestern University, called Why? And it reads as if he has gone through and said, what have I learned in my 40 years of teaching and researching the Holocaust? We will then have a session with my colleague and friend and co-author, John Roth, on Holocaust ethics. We will then hear another month from a fellow by the name of Richard Brightman, who is one of the most distinguished Holocaust scholars, who's going to talk about an uncomfortable subject, which is FDR and the Holocaust. When I reviewed Richard Brightman's co-authored book on the Holocaust, I wrote the title, and I want you only to quote, if you quote me on this, only quote the full title. I said FDR was the best of his contemporaries in dealing with the Holocaust, and the best of his predecessors and successors in dealing with genocide, but that is no compliment. I want you to understand the full extent of what I said, which is that we have blown from beginning to end, we have blown every response to genocide, including the response to the Holocaust. One person has just chatted us and said essentially that he can't start his video. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner in the black now and click start video, you'll be able to get your video, and make sure your camera is turned on. In subsequent weeks, we will also have two other lectures. Kel Rittner will be speaking about women in the Holocaust, and then we will have Laurie Barron talk about Holocaust films, and I suspect that Laurie Barron is going to assign to you one or two Holocaust films to see in advance of the work we do together. I will be with you for each of these programs, but I've invited my colleagues and friends to give you, who are the best, to give you the best of the best. Let's now talk about Holocaust, an introduction to the Holocaust, which for some of you will be a summary of what you already know, but hopefully putting it in context. And for other of you, it will be a basic introduction that will help you. I'm going to share my screen for a couple of moments just to show you. There are one of the great scholars of the Holocaust, a fellow by the name of Raoul Hilberg, who was one of the earliest of the, Danny, you have disabled my ability to share a screen. You have to make me a co-host in order to share my screen. So pipe in when you pipe.
It's done. Check it now.
Okay, now I can share my screen. Let me bring it to you and you will. Okay. Raoul Hilberg, who was one of the pioneers in this field and is regarded as the founder of the field of Holocaust studies, says if you want to understand the Holocaust, you have to understand essentially 6 words. I could use the German word, but I made 3 words out of the word mobile killing units. and you'll notice that there's a dividing line. And the 6 words essentially are deportation, expropriation, concentration, mobile killing units, death camps, deportation. Bear with me, because if I were giving you Hilberg terms, I could make mobile killing units into 1 word and death camps into 1 word. We don't have to bother with that. Let's look at this for a moment just to understand the framework. The Nazis began with an ideological perspective against the Jews. Essentially, their task at the very beginning was to eliminate the Jews from German soil and German society. And they had 2 primary goals, which were enunciated by Hitler as early as 1925. The 2 goals were, in essence, to colonialize Eastern Europe in order to allow Germany to have the sense of largesse that the United States has. Hitler envied the United States' notion of from sea to shining sea, and he wanted to expand Germany. Part of that was a response to World War I, where Germany had starvation because it did not have adequate resources to produce food for its population. The second task was to get rid of the Jews from German soil and from German lands. And as we're going to see as this evolves, this involved a contradiction and a paradox, because when war began, wherever Germany expanded, more and more Jews came under its control. If you're targeting Jews, Hilberg said, if you're targeting Jews, then your first task is to define who are the Jews. Those of you who are lawyers know that you have to specify what it is you are discriminating against or including. And that definition was a definition in 1935 of the Nuremberg Laws. And the Nuremberg Laws defined the Jews biologically based on the religion of their grandparents. That led to the bizarre situation that a Roman Catholic nun, a Roman Catholic priest, a Protestant minister were all defined as Jews. And in fact, in the 1939 census, the Germans distinguished between Jews by religion and Jews by race. They targeted both of them, but all of a sudden, if you had Jewish blood within you, that was sufficient to victimize you. And the only debate was whether half Jews and quarter Jews, those who had 2 Jewish grandparents or 1 Jewish grandparent, were to be targeted. The second was a policy that began in 1933 and never ended. And that's what Hilberg describes in economic terms as expropriation, taking away of Jewish property. And why do I say it never ended? You just had a Supreme Court case, 2 of them, in fact, about what happens to Jewish property that was taken from a population that was under duress, that was non-citizens. What happens to Jewish property under those circumstances? But the idea of the Nazis at the beginning is we are going to take away Jewish property and Jewish livelihood and the capacity of Jews to live. And if you make it impossible for Jews to live, they will leave. And the task at the beginning was to get Jews to migrate. The problem with any migration is nobody wanted the Jews, which became clear in a very basic way at a place called Evacuation in 1938, in July of 1938, when every nation said we have a refugee problem, and 32 nations said, let somebody else solve the problem. If you're looking in Jewish history, or even in American history, you can call this period of time disemancipation. Getting the Jews de-emancipated, losing civil and political rights, introducing segregation and apartheid, and essentially turning back the clock to the point where Jews had no rights. And this is a policy of disemancipation All of this was designed to get Jews to leave. The idea is if you can't live in Germany as a Jew, you will leave. The problem with that ultimately it became that, number one, no nation wanted the Jews in the numbers in which they had to leave. And number two, the Nazis kept getting more and more Jews under their control. The third step of it for Hilberg is called concentration. And don't think of concentration camps, but think of it as bringing Jews together to hold them, as it were, as captive until what they did not know at the beginning. Notice I put in the word deportation because forcing Jews to be concentrated in one place, think of the ghettos, meant that they were deported from small towns and villages, from neighborhoods and locations, and brought to one place where they could be contained. And the ghetto was a place of containment until, we're going to hear, until for the Germans in retrospect, but not in prospect, it was until the infrastructure was built for the destruction of the Jews. For the Jews, it was until the war ended, until the German people came to their senses, until a rescue came, but we had to create life amidst that destruction. You then have a line because there was essentially not yet a decision to kill, and then the killing took place in two ways. You one sent mobile killers to stationary victims, town, villages, hamlets, cities. And even in one case, and you won't imagine, this tells you a little bit about the compulsion of the Nazis. They sent in Norway an entire German unit to gather 17 Jews who lived above the Arctic Circle, which meant that essentially, and in Eastern Europe, they shot them person by person, town by town, village by village, men, women, and children. And most of you think of that as shooting by only the Germans. The reality was the shooting was also took place, and the killings also took place by locals. That's what happened in Jedwabne in Poland. By native anti-Semites, so 2 out of 3 Jews killed in Lithuania were killed by Lithuanians, not by Germans. 100% of the Jews killed in Estonia were killed by Estonians, not by Germans. And they were killed in mobile killing units. They were killed close to home. They were killed where people could see. If we had time, I would show you that they brought little children to this, kids in short pants, to witness this. And there is a priest today by the name of Father Dubois, who was going to these towns and villages and interviewing people in their 90s and in their late 80s, who, and this is 1941 and 42, so it's 78 and 79 years ago, was interviewing people who were 10 or 11 or 12 or 6 or 7, who were showing him where the Jews are buried. When mobile units, living killing units could not work, they changed the metaphor, and this is the key to the Holocaust. If at first you send mobile killers to stationary victims, when that becomes too difficult for the killers and too public, they reversed the process and they sent mobile Jews to stationary killing centers. And the means by which they made them mobile was by deporting them. The instrumentality was the railroad car. And let me give you one figure that will make it very, very clear. Auschwitz had 44 parallel railroad tracks. Penn Station in New York, which some of you have been to, has 21. So why did Auschwitz become Auschwitz? Because the infrastructure was there for the destruction to take place. Treblinka, which killed the Jews of Warsaw, was on the Warsaw to Białystok line. So who were the populations that they destroyed? The Jews of Warsaw, the Jews of Białystok, and the people in between. And the idea was that you would have an assembly line of death. That's the structure that Hilberg imposed. It's one way of grasping the wholeness of the Holocaust. Let me give you another structure. And I'm sorry, I wanted to do it on one page, so it may not be large on your screen. But let me take you through it and look at it. We were working with how do you describe the entire Holocaust, each stage in different words, in one word, so that people can grasp it. And let me take you through this so you'll begin to understand. Origin. The origin now is very interesting and intriguing because everybody's asking the question in our world, which has become attractive to authoritarian rule, and this is a global phenomenon. How is it that a democratic society moves to authoritarianism? How do we move from democracy, which is precious, but also precarious? How do we move to a dictatorship? The origin of this became in several things. It happened during the defeat of Germany in World War I, which was unexpected. The imposition by the Versailles Treaty of harsh conditions, which did not allow Germany to come back to any normal self. And those of you who know American history think of the contrary way in which we handled German defeat after World War I, after World War II, the way in which we created the Marshall Plan, and think of Japan. And if you look at who did the United States defeat after World War II, and you look at two very prosperous countries, you're looking at Germany and Japan because we didn't allow it to fester. The origin was essentially a far-right movement that believed that they were stabbed in the back. The origin was polarization and economic dislocation, a society that could no longer come to the center, and a society that was ruled on one hand by extreme right and on the other hand extreme left, that had a government that couldn't come together, that couldn't function, that couldn't solve the problems, that had essentially also a situation in which the economic security of the middle class was destroyed. And if those conditions seem to be ripe in other countries, that's one of the conditions for the rise of authoritarian rule and ultimately, in Hitler's case, totalitarian rule. They targeted the Jews. And the question as to why they targeted the Jews comes to anti-Semitism. And the anti-Semitism of the Nazis, and if I were to give you a long lecture on anti-Semitism, and I just finished a 16-week session on that, we'd have to say that anti-Semitism varies according to the source, according to the priority, and the source can be political, economic. In the Nazi case, it was racial. It can be political, it can be economic, it can be social. It varies according to the source, and it varies according to the priority, how much the anti-Semite cares about anti-Semitism. It varies according to the instability of society. In a stable society that is economically prosperous, anti-Semitism declines. In a stable society in non-stable society, which is suffering from economic dislocation, anti-Semitism can thrive. Now, you have to understand that in Germany and in Europe, the Jews were the significant other, the one target. Hatred today in the United States is thriving, but it's not only directed at Jews, it's directed at multiple victims. And that ironically provides a little bit of a safety for the Jews. But if I were lecturing you on anti-Semitism today, I would essentially also say that we are suffering through 5 simultaneous crises. You all know we have a health crisis. We all know we have an economic crisis that is the result of the health crisis. We all know that we also have a social justice crisis in which a number of segments of society feel that they are not being paid attention to, that they're not benefiting in any equal way. That can either be racial, it can also be economic. In other words, the lower working class white community feels that it's also set against them. We're suffering a climate crisis. In California, we have fires. In Louisiana, they have hurricanes. And the climate crisis, whether you want to talk about climate change or not, the climate crisis is real. And finally, we're also suffering from a leadership crisis, which is our leadership can't come together and they can't respond, they can't get the growth that is needed. One of the most exciting things which we're witnessing today is that scientific leadership was able to marshal the resources to come up with a vaccine in an incredible period of time. But the question is whether our political leadership can come together between the state and the national level and the economic support that's needed to distribute the vaccine, even though it saves the lives of everyone. In that case, the question becomes multiple crises is fertile ground for anti-Semitism. Nazis in power. We have to remember Hitler came to power legally. He came to power at the head of a coalition government. He came to power. Some people voted for Hitler because he was an anti-Semite. Some voted for him despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite. Conservatives felt that they could get their agenda through with him, and they thought that as men of experience, and I'm using men because it was all male leadership at that point, as men of experience and wisdom, they would be able to control him and he would not be able to control them. And they also bet on one other thing. They bet that, in essence, that essentially the majesty of office would move Hitler to the center. Once in power, he would automatically moderate, and they gambled on that and lost. Hitler's rise to power ended up with violence, and violence occurred in a series of elements. We could go through it all the way through. The ultimate violence, if the violence was anything from the book burning to the boycott. The violence was the attack on individual Jews. The violence occurred also at its culmination point in what is called Kristallnacht, but really we now call the November pogroms. And the November pogroms were the attempt to blow the synagogues up, set them on fire, destroy Jewish businesses, arrest 30,000 Jewish men, loot Jewish businesses, and make sure, in the words of Hermann Göring, who said at the aftermath of Kristallnacht, he said, "I would hate to be a Jew in Germany today." Violence culminated. We're going to see that violence becomes systematic and becomes lethal. What was the Jewish response? The Jewish response was twofold. Jewish response, first of all, was to try to escape massive migration of Jews. The problem with migration of Jews was that twofold. Nobody wanted the Jews. The one place on earth that wanted the Jews was Palestine. And I'm being a historian now, not a political statement. The name of what that land was prior to 48 was Palestine, not Israel. The one place that wanted Jews was Palestine, and the British closed Palestine to the Jews, allowing only for 15,000 people a year to immigrate from 1939 onward, when the need was for millions to get out. The United States had what we call paper walls, and the United States also had essentially a closeness to immigration. And the closeness to immigration meant essentially that Jews could not come, And when they needed to come, they needed 7 different sorts of documents, including a certificate of good conduct. They needed a sponsor. And some of you on this are either the people who went through this or the children of people who went through this trying to come to the United States. The second, and we have to understand this, and I want you to learn a phrase and internalize a phrase. Just because Jews were powerless does not mean they were passive. What was the response of the Jews? The response of the Jews was to turn inward toward one another and to seek support from one another. And that also meant that there was a morphing of the synagogue, a transition of the synagogue to serve the needs of the Jewish people. Synagogues also, when Jewish kids were kicked out of schools, Jewish synagogues became schools. On Monday, they could be a welfare office. On Tuesday, they could be a office for immigration. On Monday night, they could have theater because Jewish actors could not perform on stage. On Tuesday night, it could be a philharmonic, and on Wednesday night, it could be an opera. It was a place in which language was taught, because if you wanted to migrate, you needed to learn new languages, English or Spanish or Hebrew or whatever have you. And by the time the synagogues were destroyed, it was destroying the heart of the Jewish community. Martin Buber, the great Jewish thinker, established an entire program of adult learning so people should at least know why they were suffering. And the Jewish community drew together in very intense ways. I just finished writing an introduction to a 760-page book on the statistics of German Jewry from 1815 to 1939. And the intriguing thing is, during this period of time, marriages increased. And the reason marriages increased is that people needed someone to go through this with, and if they were dating a young woman or a young man, they got serious very quickly, and either they migrated together or they suffered together. Marriages increased, and interestingly enough, virtually immediately after marriages, you had even a slight increase of children. Next step is war. Germany expanded, and war was the key to achieving one goal and having unintended consequences in another way. Germany absorbed Austria in 1938, absorbed part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, in 1938, invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939 and destroyed it, then invaded Poland in 1939, September, invaded Western Europe and then Eastern Europe. Invaded Western Europe in 1940, everything from France to Belgium to the Netherlands. Conquest, conquest, conquest. And then invaded Greece and Yugoslavia and put itself on the brink in 1941 to invade the Soviet Union. And we're grateful it invaded the Soviet Union because that led to ultimately the real defeat of Adolf Hitler. War brought an unintended consequences, which is if you want to get rid of the Jews, but you invade Poland and get 2 million Jews under your control immediately, you've only got, if you invade Austria, let me put it to you this way, 150,000 Jews left Germany before the invasion of Austria, 1938. One night, 200,000 more came under German control. So if you wanted to get rid of the Jews, you've now increased the problem. In 1939, when you have now invaded Poland, your 150,000 remaining Jews, your 150,000 or 300,000 remaining Jews in Germany have now become 2.5 million. And you have a problem, there's nowhere for them to go. Therefore, they put them in a ghetto. Ghettos began in 1939, they existed until 1944 in Poland. The ghetto in Poland was a 4-year period of time. The ghetto in Hungary was 6 weeks. The ghetto in Macedonia was 21 days. In each place, the ghetto was a place to contain Jews, and they contained Jews until what? Until an infrastructure was built for their destruction and trades could be provided. Killing began of Jews in earnest on June 22nd, 1941, with the German entree into the former Soviet Union. That's when they moved in with mobile killing units, and they also exploited local anti-Semites, local police, the army, and even native anti-Semites to murder the Jews near their homes, village by village, town by town, bullet by bullet, men, women, and children. There's a debate as to who the killers are. We don't have to go into work on that, whether they were ordinary men. And I tend to believe that they were ordinary men who became extraordinarily skilled at becoming killing units. But there was a consequence to this, two consequences to this that were not intended. First consequence is that it was public and people could see it. In fact, people even came out to see it. And in certain cases, the villagers wanted to kill their own Jews because they didn't want Germany to inherit, to exploit, not inherit, to capture all of the property of these Jews, especially the mobile property. Remember, locals could move into the non-mobile property, homes, apartments, businesses. But Germany, if it murdered these Jews, took all of the mobile property that they had, everything from tablecloths to sheets to towels to everything else imaginable. So they participated in what? Gaining the wealth of this community. And even poor people have many different types of possessions. And they even had specialists with possessions, people who were experts on, for example, somebody's stamp collection, somebody's coin collection. Some people had unusual collection of rare fish or whatever have you. They had experts who went through this. So some of the locals killed just because they wanted to inherit the property. The second consequence was it was difficult, very, very difficult for the killers to kill on a daily basis. We know it from some of their diaries. We know it from the fact that they needed alcohol afterwards, and then they needed alcohol before, and they needed alcohol during. And the best statement of this was by somebody who complained to Himmler, look in the eyes of these men, what are we creating, a nation of neurotics or savages? And that is that you had many mental breakdowns occurring, including among officers, and this became difficult. Therefore, that led to what is called a decision, but really a decision to kill the Jews was made by Adolf Hitler. How to kill the Jews was implemented at a very famous meeting of January 20th, 1942, called the Wannsee Conference. 15 men were gathered on gender specific. They were what we call the best and the brightest in German society. 8 of them had doctorates, lawyers, and the like. And the decision was made, let me tell you, not the decision was made. Let me tell you the implications of Wannsee in one sentence. When the Germans met on January 20th, 1942, 75 or 80% of the Jews were still alive. 8 out of 10 were still alive. 15 months later, 8 out of 10 were already dead. And that meant that the decision was made, how are we going to kill the Jews? We're going to kill the Jews by deportation to stationary killing centers, which combine Charles Darwin and Henry Ford. Darwin's survival of the fittest and Henry Ford, the assembly line. And let me give you statistics for a moment. But remember, when I give you statistics, we're talking about individual people. Moshe and Chaim, Sarah and Rivka, Hans and Gertrude, individual people and little children. 1.5 million of these people children under 16 became victims. Let me give you statistics. Auschwitz was open in March of 1942. It closed in December of 42. All the Jews of Galicia were killed. 500,000 Jews were killed. 2 known survivors. Staff of Belzec was 104, of whom only 14 were German, 90 of them were Ukrainians. Treblinka opened on July 22nd, 1942. By the way, for religious Jews, and I know that Rabbi Schaff is on this call, that's Erev Tisha B'Av, and closed on August 4th, 1943. 925,000 Jews were killed, with a staff of 120, of whom only 30 were Germans. So 44 Germans were literally responsible for the murder of 4,025,000 Jews. That's what I mean by a factory. Imagine if you had 44 workers who were able to create 1.4 million anything, and you see the death camp as that. That's what we call annihilation. And all of you from survivor stories know that at every stage of the game, there was a struggle to survive. Struggle to survive in the camps, a struggle to survive in the ghettos, a struggle to survive the shooting units, and you need the question of rescue and hiding. And then the last stage of Auschwitz was what is the Germans called in a fancy word evacuation, what we know as death marches, which is moving the Jews from the camps before they're captured and can bear witness, moving them on foot in the dead of winter, in the winter of 1944-45, inland into German landed concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald among them, with the idea that we don't want to let them be captured alive. We no longer have the capacity to transport them on trains. Therefore, we're going to walk them to death. This is what Jews called, not evacuation, Jews called it the right way, death marches. That led to ultimately liberation. But liberation took, in the words of Viktor Frankl, liberation took time, much time, and for some it never came at all. The words of a woman by the name of Hadassah Rosenstoff, for 12 years we feared death, and in the 13th year we learned that we also feared life. The question after liberation was, where do we go? What do we do? How do we rebuild ourselves? And this leads to one of the great miracles of Jewish life, which we call the return to life. This is the capacity of the survivors to return to life after having seen what they had seen. Now, let me illustrate it to you in a very important way. Survivors were retained in displaced persons camps. Immediately after the Holocaust, these displaced person camps became a place where survivors married. And they married because they had lost everything. They wanted someone. And very often these were marriages of survival, which later became marriages of love. Very shortly thereafter, 9 months thereafter, 10 months thereafter, 12 months thereafter, they had children. And these children essentially were had a burden placed on them. They were to make up for everyone that was lost. But think of what a child is. A child is hope in the future, in an unknown future. I once interviewed a man by the name of Rabbi Arnold Weider, and he was the mole of Boston. And some of you who know baseball know that Boston has a great love for the New York Yankees. So in Boston, since he was a mole, they called him the Yankee Clipper, with no apologies to Joe DiMaggio. I asked him, when I interviewed him, I said, where did you learn to be a mole? He said, I learned to be a mole at Bergen-Belsen. And I said, what do you mean you learned to be a mole at Bergen-Belsen? He said, in the immediate aftermath of the war, many Jews who did not circumcise their children during the war wanted their sons circumcised. And then children began to be born, and we circumcised the boys. And I scratched myself and I said, imagine this as a personal symbol, that for 5 years, if a Jewish man lowered his trousers, he was killed. If you were pretending to be a non-Jew, but you were circumcised, and Jews were the only men circumcised in Europe, then you were killed on the spot. And on the 13th year, what? On the 13th year, they dared to circumcise their kids, not knowing where they would live, not knowing how they would live, not knowing that the Nazis were not going to return, not knowing what the world was going to be. They redoubled their effort into Jewish life. And if you see also the number of survivors who wanted to go to Palestine, whether legally or illegally, essentially they made Zionism a moral crusade of a world that had been shattered and led to the rebirth of the state of Israel, because not only did they return to life, but they also returned to Jewish life. And one of the reasons survivors are moral heroes in our generation is because they've demonstrated resilience, the capacity to face death, and to create life in its aftermath, and to create also Jewish life in its aftermath, which was a gamble for the future. Now, not everybody remained Jewish. Remember, you have the Madeleine Albright's family of the world. This is not to fault her. But her parents learned what? That being Jewish was dangerous. It was the third rail of family experience. And consequently, they didn't want to be Jewish. So she, a brilliant woman that she was, had Jewish cousins, but could never bring herself to realize until it was much later that she herself was of Jewish origin. You have thousands of Jews in Poland who, in the aftermath of democracy, came out of the closet and told the dirty family secret, you know, you're Jewish. And every day in Krakow or in Warsaw, people come into the JCC or the synagogue and say, you know, I have a Jewish grandparent. And some will say, my mother's mother is Jewish. And then the rabbi or the teacher has to whisper them, you know, you're Jewish. Because for 50 or 70 years, the family had hidden that secret. But that means the survivors who came out and recreated Jewish life did something miraculous. And finally, the world had to create something as well. And this is, they had to bring the wicked ones, the ones who had committed the crime, to justice. At first, it was symbolic justice of 22. And then it became an attempt to try the doctors for what they did, the lawyers for the judicial system, the businessmen, and then the perpetrators of a variety of different things as the world tried to rebuild the scaffolding of justice, the illusion of justice, what we might even call imperfect, inadequate justice. And Nuremberg has served as, in one sense, Nuremberg has served as the model of what we have to do in the world in the aftermath of injustice, which is we have to try to create justice, even the illusion of justice. So if you look at this framework, you can fit in, and I didn't deal with rescue. I forgot, and you'll forgive me, but understand this, and here I want to say one word about rescue, which is very, very important element about rescue. Yad Vashem has called these people the righteous among them, and what they did was extraordinary. But the most important thing for us to understand is they were not necessarily extraordinary. They were ordinary people who retained their humanity, their decency, their integrity, their values in a world that shattered all of those. But one of the problems of calling them righteous is it makes it beyond our reach. And part of what we have to understand as we teach this material, those of your teachers, is that it's not beyond our reach to be decent in a world of indecency, to be honorable in a world of dishonor, to offer a crust of bread, a piece of bread to somebody who's hungry, to offer shelter to somebody in need, to stand up, to speak out. We call them in Holocaust literature, a very important word, we call them upstanders as opposed to bystanders. Upstanders mean people who are capable of doing something. And I want us to understand that it's not beyond the reach of individual people to have this moment of nobility and this moment of decency. It's within all our capacity. I've taken about 45 minutes, which is what I've assigned. I've given you an awful lot. Let's take questions. If you put them in the chat, that may be the easiest way to handle them. Those of you who don't know how to chat is at the bottom. We all know how to use. Eric Moses says, my 6 definitions can be translated into 2 words. I'd like to know the 2 words, Eric. So if you come back with that. As European Jews with an unhealthy second-generation World War II syndrome, I'm disappointed by your history lesson. You're kicking in open doors. Okay. How similar is Hitler and how he came to power to Donald Trump? I don't believe anybody can be compared to Hitler. I don't allow comparisons to the Holocaust whatsoever. Let me say this, that there are certain analogies. Some people presume that the president, the majesty of the office of the president, would force him to moderate his language and his behavior. It didn't happen. The difference between the two of them, which is monumental, is Hitler came with a complete ideology of what he wanted to implement, and he was enormously skillful in implementing it. And if you take what Hitler's agenda was, he came very close to world conquest. And frankly, if 2 things had not happened, he would have gotten world conquest. There's a very peculiar thing that people don't know, which is that the Soviet Union built its railroad tracks on a very different railroad tracks throughout the world are of standard division between the wheels, so that railroad tracks can go throughout Europe from one place to another without any issue. Soviet tracks, because Russia was afraid of invasion, are of different size. Now that meant that it became impossible without offloading and reloading to provide supplies for German troops in the Soviet Union. And that meant 2 things. It meant that Germany, which expected immediate conquest and the Soviet Union to fall, did not prepare its soldiers for winter and could not equip its soldiers to withstand the Soviet winter. And very thankfully, the winter of 1941-42 was the coldest winter in European history up to that point, which meant that German troops had to suffer in summer clothing and summer provisions for the winter of the Soviet Union. That gave rise to all sorts of things. The second thing is he refused to learn the lesson of Napoleon, which is you don't go to a two-front war. Had he only invaded the Soviet Union instead of the West as well, he would have been in very different circumstances. And we are fortunate that. We're also fortunate, ironically, that Joseph Stalin could withstand the loss of 25 million people in his country because he was a dictator, and therefore could withstand all of that loss, which would not have happened. Esther has asked a question about, and the last thing of luck, by the way, is however you want to criticize Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I joke that in my field, the easiest way to get booed by a Jewish audience is to tell them that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not as bad as they think he was. The one thing I am grateful to Franklin Delano Roosevelt for is that he got the United States into World War II. And he got us equipped to fight World War II. And that was not a given. Those of you who saw the recent TV show, The Plot Against America by HBO, and who read Philip Roth's incredible novel on the plot against America, which fantasizes, God forbid, that Charles Limbaugh had been what? Had been run for president, and Roosevelt was not elected for a third term, and the consequences of an isolationist coming to power, and Hitler therefore having what? Unrestrained power and no American opposition. That could have happened. And Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America, and I don't often recommend Philip Roth to reading, especially not in front of Rabbi Schiff. But having said that, this novel is an incredible novel to read because it makes it real. Esther asked the question, why didn't the Jews fight back other than war? So I want to say the Jews fought back in a variety of ways. We only know of Warsaw. But let's talk for a moment about resistance. There is a Swiss historian who said that there were 4 different types of resistance, the last being armed resistance. The first form of resistance he calls polemical resistance, which is resisting the Germans or the occupying power by words, by deeds, by publication, by the like, even by humor. The second form of resistance was essentially self-help, helping each other in all sorts of ways and working in that way. And Jews did. You even had charity drives in ghettos and the like with all sorts of elements of self-help. The third is cultural resistance, and that is maintaining what we call spiritual resistance, maintaining one's dignity in a world that wants to dehumanize that. And the last form of resistance was armed resistance. Jews fought in the ghettos. Bialystok had a resistance, a series of ghettos had resistance. They fought at the moment when they understood that they were going to die and when they had nothing left to lose. And they wanted to live for a very, very brief moment as free people because they were no longer afraid of dying. There were uprisings in 3 camps. Treblinka had an uprising on August 4th, 1943, which is why Treblinka was destroyed. Auschwitz had an uprising on October 7th, 1944, which is why one of the crematoria was blown up. Sobibor had an uprising, which was made famous in a film called Escape from Sobibor. Jews fought with the partisans in Yugoslavia. Jews were overwhelmingly represented in the underground and in the resistance in France. Jews fought alone and isolated. The most famous instances of some Jews fighting on the Belsky Brigade, which not only was a fighting of Jews, but also a rescue mission, because they saved women and children, the elderly, and not just men of fighting age. So the question sometimes becomes, what forms of resistance took place? When did resistance break out? And Jews were handicapped in resistance in several ways. Unlike a traditional guerrilla force, Jews could not blend into the population, and they couldn't count on support from the population. So, for example, in Vietnam, which we saw, the Viet Cong could blend into the population would not betray them. In Poland, you had a whole range of people who were willing to betray the Jews. Same thing in Lithuania, the same thing in the Ukraine. Number two, to blend into the population, even to escape, you needed certain skills. You needed a language skill. You had to be able to speak without an accent. You needed a cultural skill. The cultural skill is you had to know the customs of the local population. Ironically, religious women were better equipped than religious men to survive, because religious men who went to yeshiva didn't have the knowledge of the local landscape as religious women who went to public schools. In many a town before Beis Yaakov and even after Beis Yaakov, a whole range of religious girls went to public schools, therefore they spoke Polish or Lithuanian without an accent. They knew the culture. Some of them even had non-Jewish friends that they could associate with, and they were better equipped to survive on the outside. And the other element involved in resistance is you had to presume that the question was not how you live, whether you live or die. You had to presume that you were going to likely suffer major defeat and destruction, but you had to be willing to say, I want to fight for Jewish honor, Jewish dignity. I want to take down the enemy and work in that way. Are there any other questions that we have for the chat room? Because I can't see you folks, or I can only see about half the audience. If you have a question, put it in the chat room. And I'll go one more round and look at the other group and see if anybody wants to raise their hand. And if you want to raise your hand, I'll be able to answer your question. Okay, let me turn it back to Sharon then, please. Sharon, we can't hear you. Unmute.
Okay. Dr. Berenbaum, we would like to thank you so very much, first of all, for providing us with an outstanding framework for those of us that are both teachers in the classroom and also for our own knowledge on how to approach the Holocaust because it's so complicated for so many of us. And you've given us a clearer pathway to be able to share that with our students and for our own knowledge. And every time I hear you speak, which has been many times, I have to tell you that personally, I always learn something new. And this time more than just one thing. So I want to thank you so much for your tremendous depth of knowledge and for the ability to share that in such a wonderful way. So we're looking forward to the rest of the series, and we will be in touch with everyone that participated today and that came to hear you. We thank you very much for everyone that was here today. And if you have any questions, you can always email us. You will be getting a survey also.
Sharon, before we leave, Rabbi Schiff, you had a question. Please unmute yourself, Rabbi Schiff.
Okay. Father Dubois, who you mentioned, I heard him lecture, and he mentioned approximately 1.5 million Jews that were killed in areas that he did research. Is there a way, or is it possible for update the numbers from 6 million?
Let me tell you, Rabbi, why it's impossible. And I want everybody to remember we're in the year 2020. We're in the year 2020, in which one of the issues is taking a census. The reason it's impossible is the following. The Soviet Union took a census in 1939, and it refused to take a census in 1949, in 1949. And the reason it refused to take a census in 1949 is because if they had taken a census in 1949, they would have had to show, as a result, that they had very few men of a fighting age, because most of the men of a fighting age who could form an army were killed in the massive destruction of Soviet soldiers and the like. Therefore, the next time they took a census was 1959. That means if you want the number of Jews, you have to begin by saying how many Jews declared themselves Jews in 1939, how many Jews declared themselves Jews in 1959. Of the gap between those two numbers, I'm giving you a technical answer because I worked on this for 6 months to try to find out if we could get that. You have to say, what is the natural death over 20 years? What is the loss by migration? What is the loss by assimilation? Meaning, if you married a non-Jewish woman, non-Jewish man, would you then put on your passport Yivrei, or would you not put on your identity card Yivrei? And what is the loss by war? And what is the loss by Holocaust, by genocide? And you can only get, at best, guesstimates. Now, that means that anybody who's a serious demographer, and I try to convene a conference of serious demographers, anybody who's a serious demographer only can guess. Now, the way you can do it also, the second way you can do it also, is to go about, I'm giving you a longer answer than you may have wanted, but I'm giving you a technical answer. The way you could do that is to go town by town, village by village, and the like, see what the Jewish population was, presume that X number of people left before, and then say, of that population, the numbers killed were 82, 79, 30, 38, 96, I don't know, percentage of the population, and guess that way. The answer is we probably have lost more people. The number dead goes between a low of 5.1, we're not talking about deniers, a low of 5.1 million people, which is a figure that Roel Hilberg gives because he can document person by person by person 5.1 million people, to a figure of 5.6 to 5.8 that somebody like Yehuda Bauer will give, to a figure in excess of 7.2 million that was given by Selo Baron at the Eichmann trial. And you're of the generation, Rabbi Schiff, that remembers Selo Baron. And when I went to university, the rule was, if you wanted to do your PhD, you had to know about 5 years of Jewish history, what Baron knew about all of Jewish history, because he was a brilliant, brilliant historian. So we can't know the figures. 6 million is an accurate and appropriate figure, but it's worth looking at.
Thank you.
Okay? That's a complete answer for you. Sharon, I'll go back to you, but I wouldn't end without taking Rabbi Schiff's question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sharon, you're still muted.
Thank you to everyone. Again, we're really looking forward to the next session with Professor Hayes. And thank you again so much for your time and for everyone participating today.
Happy
Have a good
Hanukkah.
evening.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.